The morning of November 8th began with the same comforting predictability that had defined countless previous episodes of The View. To anyone watching from the outside, it was just another day in the bustling New York studio, a well-oiled machine that had been perfected over years of live television. Audience members, bundled in coats and scarves against the crisp fall air, eagerly filed into the studio lobby. Their faces glowed with excitement as they were ushered into the audience seating area, chatting among themselves about which celebrity guests might cause sparks today, who might say something that would go viral, and whether Joy Behar would deliver another one of her infamous verbal jabs. Inside the studio, the environment was its own living organism. The iconic red couches gleamed under the glow of freshly calibrated studio lights, polished so thoroughly they almost shimmered. Camera operators moved with quiet precision, adjusting their angles, calibrating focus, and mapping out their movements for the upcoming segments. Every technician in the building had their rhythm. Sound engineers performed final level checks, listening intently through their headsets as they dialed in the exact balance needed to make live TV sound effortless. Stage managers, pacing with clipboards in hand, called out instructions and cues, ensuring that every single piece of the operation was in its proper place. In the control room, a glassing, closed fortress of blinking monitors, color-coded scripts, and frantic energy, producers huddled over their rundown sheets. They rehearsed transitions, debated timing adjustments, and discussed potential on-air pivots. Everything pointed toward a smooth, predictable show, nothing unusual, nothing unexpected, nothing that hinted at the storm that was quietly heading their way. According to the official schedule, Tom Cruise wasn't expected to arrive until 9:47 a.m., just in time to be ushered into makeup before appearing in the 10:15 segment. But Tom was famous, almost mythically so, for his punctuality, for treating professionalism not as a suggestion, but as a moral obligation. So when he walked through the studio doors at exactly 8:30 a.m., the entire staff froze in momentary disbelief. There he was, not flanked by a small army of assistants, not shielded behind sunglasses, not absorbed in a phone call, and not acting like a man who believed the world owed him reverence. Instead, he entered with a warm, genuine smile that almost felt like sunshine cutting through the cold morning air. "Morning, everyone," he called out, his voice carrying effortlessly across the studio floor. It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, it was simply sincere enough to make every exhausted crew member lift their heads and exchange looks of surprise. "Hope I'm not too early." To people who worked behind the scenes, celebrities were nothing new. They had met the full spectrum of human behavior disguised as fame. There were the divas who demanded water of a very specific temperature, neither cold nor room temperature, but something oddly in between. There were the method actors who insisted on being addressed by their character's name, refusing to acknowledge any reality outside their performance. And then there were the new age social media influencers, glued to their phones, constantly adjusting their hair and ignoring everyone around them. But Tom Cruise was different. He didn't just stand there waiting to be escorted. He jumped into the space as if he belonged to it, as if the studio crew were his colleagues rather than invisible workers behind the curtain. He shook hands with camera operators. Firm handshake, direct eye contact, the whole thing. He remembered names within seconds, repeating them back with a level of warmth that made people blink in surprise. He walked over to the production assistant, usually the most overlooked people on any set, and asked them how long they had worked on the show. He complimented the lighting team on their setup. He asked the makeup artist how her weekend had been, and he actually listened, when she told him about her daughter's school play. It was disarming, it was unexpected, it was Tom Cruise at his absolute best. "Mr. Cruise, you really didn't have to come so early," one of the assistant producers stammered as she hurried over, clearly flustered. She had been reviewing the segment outline in the hallway, and hadn't expected the biggest star of the day, possibly the biggest star of the decade, to appear over an hour early. He gave her that signature smile, the one that had melted audiences for 4 decades. "I like to be prepared," he said simply, "and I like to meet the people who make the magic happen." It was such a small sentence, but it instantly humanized him. Around the room, shoulders relaxed. People smiled. The tension, routine tension that naturally lived in every live television environment, seemed to lift, but But beneath that warmth, beneath the calm composure and professional sheen, nobody, not a single person, had the slightest hint of the pressure building inside him. Nobody could have known that despite his famously stable demeanor, despite his decades, long mastery of self-control, an emotional fault line was quietly forming. He was courteous, yes. He was kind, yes. But inside, years of accumulated scrutiny, constant public expectations, and relentless pressure were beginning to weigh heavier than usual. And then there was Joy Behar. Joy, the host known for sharp wit, sharper instincts, and the uncanny ability to sense when a guest could be pushed, sometimes far past what was comfortable. She had a sixth sense for tension, for vulnerability, for cracks beneath polished surfaces. She could sniff out an emotional reaction like a predator scenting weakness. That morning, she would prod the wrong nerve. She would ask the wrong question. She would unleash the part of Tom Cruise the world had never seen, not because he was unprofessional, not because he lost control easily, but because he was human, because everyone has a limit, because even the greatest icons eventually encounter a moment that pushes them too far. And when that moment came, it wouldn't just shift the atmosphere in the studio, it would detonate. The segment producer stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by the unexpected gentleness of the world's biggest action star. Even after years of working with celebrities, she couldn't quite reconcile Tom Cruise's mythic reputation with the reality standing in front of her, a man who radiated warmth instead of ego. She fumbled with the notes in her hand. Mr. Cruise, Tom, please, you really didn't have to come so early. Tom, he corrected softly, offering her that unmistakable megawatt smile, the one audiences had adored for decades, and I like to get a feel for the space, plus. He added, lowering his voice conspiratorially, I wanted to make sure I wasn't rushing anyone. Your time is valuable too. It was such a kind, disarming statement that she didn't even know how to respond. Later, long after the events of that day became headlines, she would replay that moment in her mind and realize the irony. Tom Cruise's early arrival, his courtesy, his calm, his humility, was the final breath of peace before an unprecedented storm. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the hosts began to arrive. Whoopi Goldberg came first. Her presence always seemed to shift the studio's energy, grounded, powerful, unmistakably commanding. But the moment she saw Tom, her entire face lit up. Two had worked together years earlier on a charity initiative for underprivileged children, and their reunion was warm, genuine, free of the stiffness that so often accompanies celebrity interactions. Whoopi wrapped him in a brief but heartfelt hug. Tom, you look good, she teased. You always look good. He shot back, grinning. Next came Sarah Haynes, practically bouncing with excitement. She'd grown up watching Tom's films, and she couldn't hide her enthusiasm. Even Sunny Host, in typically the most measured, composed, and reserved member of the panel, seemed unusually animated. She asked Tom about his new film, about his research, about the emotional layers of the role. His thoughtful responses impressed her, especially the way he listened as carefully as he spoke. Then, at 9:12 a.m., Joy Behar arrived. Those who knew her well immediately recognized the look on her face. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hostility, it was calculation, sharp, subtle, the kind that revealed itself only in the tiny tightening around her eyes and the faint upward curl of her lips. A smile that looked friendly to the untrained eye, but to the veteran crew, it was a warning sign. Joy's got something planned, one camera operator murmured under his breath to a colleague. Joy approached Tom with professional politeness, her expression unreadable. Tom, wonderful to have you, she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, businesslike, no softness in it whatsoever. Joy, thanks for having me, Tom replied, his warmth unshaken. I've been a fan of the show for years. You all keep it real, and I respect that. Joy's smile widened, but only slightly, and still without reaching her eyes. Oh, we definitely keep it real here. That's our specialty. The words hovered in the space between them, coated with an edge that only a few people picked up on. Whoopi glanced over, raising an eyebrow. Something flickered across her face. Concern, a warning, but the moment passed quickly as stage managers called for mic checks and final adjustments. The pre-show bustle resumed. Tom retreated to the green room. where his publicist was waiting with a binder thick enough to be mistaken for a legal brief. She reviewed potential talking points, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. "So they'll probably ask about the stunts," she said, scanning her notes. "Maybe some questions about the younger cast members you're mentoring on this project. Standard stuff." Tom nodded, though his mind had already drifted away from the promotional bullet points. He wasn't thinking about sound bites or PR messaging. He was thinking about Shockwave Protocol, his newest film, a project that had become something far more personal than just another action blockbuster. It was a return to the gritty, high-stakes intensity that had made him a global superstar, but it was also deeper, more reflective, a meditation on the moral cost of violence, the price of responsibility, the emotional wounds hidden beneath heroism. He had poured himself into the role in a way he hadn't done in years. 8 months of training, 12-hour days performing stunts that studio lawyers warned him not to perform, late nights for writing scenes to protect the emotional integrity of the story. At 58 years old, he was still choosing the hardest path, not out of vanity, but out of pure dedication, out of a relentless commitment to craft, to authenticity, to pushing himself harder than anyone expected. His publicist continued flipping through pages, but Tom's attention had drifted to a particular moment from the film, a raw, vulnerable scene that he'd fought to keep in the final cut, a scene where the invincible action hero finally cracked, showing pain instead of perfection, a scene that mattered to him in ways he hadn't even shared with the studio. He hoped someone might ask him about it on air, but he also feared it, because that scene, that moment, was closer to his real life struggles than he'd ever admit publicly. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself, breathing deeply. The green room buzzed softly with activity. Producers whispering in headsets, assistants hurrying down hallways, the distant hum of cameras powering on. Everything felt normal, everything felt controlled, but just outside that door, Joy Behar was sharpening her words like knives, and when Tom Cruise stepped onto that stage, he would have no idea that the single most explosive moment of his public life was waiting for him. A moment that would shake the studio, a moment that would go viral within hours, a moment that would reveal a side of him the world had never seen. The day had unfolded with meticulous precision up to this point, the kind of day that would seem perfectly ordinary to anyone not intimately familiar with the electric chaos of live television. The morning had begun with a carefully orchestrated rhythm, crew members checking cameras, lighting technicians calibrating, stage managers coordinating every movement, and producers running through their notes one last time. But beneath that surface order, an undercurrent of anticipation had grown steadily, almost imperceptibly, as the clock ticked toward the segment that would go down in television history. At exactly 10:12 a.m., Tom Cruise, the man whose name alone had become synonymous with action, discipline, and unwavering professionalism, was escorted onto the set. The transition from green room to live studio was seamless, executed with the calm assurance of someone who had walked onto stages across the world for 4 decades. But even that composure could not fully contain the palpable excitement in the air. Cameras pivoted smoothly, capturing the first sight of a man whose reputation often seemed larger than life, and the audience, hundreds of loyal viewers who had followed his career from his earliest breakout roles to his current legendary status, erupted into applause. Genuine, enthusiastic appreciation echoed through the studio, a chorus of recognition for a figure who had defined the genre of action cinema for generations. Tom raised a hand in a casual wave, a practiced smile curving his lips, and the applause grew even louder, as if the audience itself was aware that this was not just another celebrity appearance. Settling into the designated guest seat with effortless poise, he exuded calmness and confidence, the hallmark of someone who understood that the public stage was not a place to perform, but a space to engage. The lights above him were warm, casting an inviting glow that highlighted the familiar features of a man whose image had been captured countless times on magazine covers, movie posters, and the big screen. The studio air seemed to buzz with electricity, a tangible anticipation that spoke not only to the audience, but to the staff and crew who had witnessed countless stars come and go. For them, there was a sense of something different, something almost cinematic in the energy surrounding this particular morning. "Welcome back to the View," Whoopi Goldberg began, her radiant smile lighting up the set. There was a fluidity to her delivery, the kind that came only from years of experience hosting live television. "We are so thrilled to have Tom Cruise with us today." Her tone carried both genuine warmth and the practiced polish of a professional who knew how to manage the delicate balance between celebrity and audience expectations. "Thank you for having me," Tom replied smoothly, his voice steady and approachable, his posture relaxed but attentive. There was a quiet strength in the way he spoke, an unspoken assurance that this encounter would unfold with mutual respect and engagement. "This is fantastic." Even in those first moments, he exuded an aura of authenticity, a rare combination of humility and magnetism that drew viewers in without effort. The initial minutes were textbook, perfect, a masterclass in public interaction, characterized by professionalism, charm, and the subtle kind of charisma that had endeared him to fans for decades. The conversation quickly turned to Shockwave Protocol, the latest project that had already generated buzz for its high-octane action and emotional depth. Tom shared anecdotes from the set, his delivery punctuated with small gestures, flashes of humor, and an infectious enthusiasm that captivated the audience. He recounted a stunt that had not gone entirely according to plan, a minor mishap that had turned into a moment of improvisation, handled with grace and ingenuity. The story drew genuine laughter, filling the studio with warmth and energy. He spoke of the young co-star who had been terrified of heights until he had spent 3 weeks personally training her, patiently guiding her through every step, instilling confidence that extended far beyond the immediate scene. He described the director's obsessive attention to practical effects, illustrating a commitment to authenticity that paralleled his own devotion to the craft. Every anecdote was laced with humility, humor, and humanity, a reminder that even legendary figures remained grounded when speaking about their work and those who supported them. The audience responded intuitively, laughing in all the right places, leaning forward in their seats during moments of suspense, and reacting with applause when Tom highlighted acts of courage or teamwork on set. The energy was positive, engaging, and intimate, as if the room had collectively entered into a dialogue rather than merely witnessing a scripted performance. In this environment, Tom thrived. The first 8 minutes felt effortless, a seamless blend of storytelling, entertainment, and genuine connection. Sarah Haynes, one of the co-hosts, directed the conversation toward his training regimen. Tom handled the questions with his characteristic humility, immediately redirecting credit to the stunt team, the trainers, and the array of professionals who ensured that every scene looked flawless. His words emphasized collaboration, respect, and the often invisible work that underpinned cinematic magic. He spoke not as a solitary star, but as a participant in a broader effort, acknowledging the skill, dedication, and sacrifices of those around him. It was a lesson in leadership conveyed without arrogance, a subtle but powerful demonstration of the values he had maintained throughout his career. Sunny Hostin, in her usual composed and analytical manner, steered the conversation toward his role mentoring the next generation of action stars. Tom's response was impassioned yet measured. He spoke of responsibility, not simply in terms of physical technique, but in the moral and ethical dimensions of influence. He emphasized the importance of respecting one's crew, honoring commitments, and putting in the hard work even when no one was watching. He described mentorship as a sacred duty, a passing down of not just practical knowledge, but integrity, empathy, and professionalism, the intangible qualities that distinguish enduring legends from fleeting celebrities. His words were deliberate, reflective, and resonant, capturing the attention of both the audience and the panel, who recognized in his speech a sincerity that transcended mere publicity. Even as the discussion progressed smoothly, there was an underlying tension, a quiet sense that beneath the surface, Tom's experiences carried a psychological weight that had accumulated over decades. His tales of stunts and mentorship were punctuated by hints of the personal cost of relentless discipline the physical and emotional toll that fame and perfection exacted. The moments of humor and warmth were punctuated with subtle reflections on endurance, resilience, and the invisible scars left by a lifetime of pushing oneself to extremes. He spoke with honesty, a rawness tempered by professional control, and a depth that hinted at a more vulnerable side, one the audience could sense but might not yet fully comprehend. At this stage, the stage was perfectly set. The conversation was flowing, the audience was engaged, the energy was high, the warmth palpable. Tom Cruise, in his element, had created a space that was inviting, entertaining, and instructive, bridging the gap between cinematic legend and human being. And yet, as smooth and controlled as everything appeared, the day was far from ordinary. Beneath the laughter, beneath the applause, beneath the smiles, the real story, the one that would erupt in ways no one anticipated, was quietly approaching. It was a day that promised drama beyond the script, a collision between celebrity composure and the unpredictability of live television. Tom Cruise was performing as only he could, perfectly himself, unaware that the perfect storm was gathering. And when it arrived, the world would witness a side of him that no film, no interview, and no public appearance had ever revealed before. A moment raw, unscripted, and unforgettable. The studio seemed to pause as if time itself had slowed, the familiar rhythm of the morning replaced by a heavy, almost tangible tension. What had started as a routine interview had transformed into something altogether different, something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable. The warm, inviting atmosphere that had defined the first 10 minutes was gone, replaced by a charged silence that threaded through every corner of the room. Even the air seemed heavier, as though the very oxygen in the studio had thickened in anticipation of what was coming next. Tom Cruise, seated in his usual posture, straight, backed, composed, hands resting lightly on his knees, remained outwardly calm, his face an almost perfect mask of serenity, but the subtle shift in the room was undeniable. From the back rows of the audience to the camera operators manning their equipment, from the production assistants skimming scripts to the co-hosts arranged around the familiar semicircle, every individual sensed that something fundamental had changed. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly, her fingers drumming lightly on the table in front of her, a subtle rhythmic accompaniment to the storm she was about to unleash. The slight tilt of her head, the faint narrowing of her eyes, and the deliberate cadence of her voice signaled that this was no longer a conversation, no longer a casual dialogue about a film or an upcoming project. This was a calculated assault disguised as an inquiry, a surgical strike aimed at the foundation of Tom Cruise's public image. She began carefully, framing her words with the precision of someone who had honed the art of ambush over decades of live television. "As if you're some kind of moral authority," she said, her tone conversational on the surface, but laced with a subtle, almost predatory edge beneath. "I'm just wondering if you see the contradiction there, because a lot of people watching might see it." The phrasing was deliberate. It was more than a question. It was an ambush cloaked in the guise of legitimate journalism, a carefully constructed setup designed to provoke, embarrass, and assert dominance. It was the kind of line that forced the subject to react, to reveal cracks in composure, to expose the human vulnerability beneath the carefully cultivated public persona. The studio seemed to hold its collective breath. The audience sat frozen, unaware of the intricate psychological dynamics at play, but responsive in instinct. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the energy of the room. The camera operators, typically invisible and neutral, adjusted their focus ever so slightly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in real time. Even the co-hosts, seasoned professionals accustomed to tension and controversy, were momentarily caught off guard by the sudden, unspoken threat embedded in her words. For a full 3 seconds, an eternity in live television, Tom Cruise remained perfectly still. His expression was unreadable, a flawless veneer of control and calm. His posture did not betray the slightest hint of discomfort, yet everyone present felt it, a shift subtle yet profound, emanating from the man who had spent 40 years navigating Hollywood's treacherous waters with unmatched precision. Something in the studio changed in those 3 seconds. The air vibrated with anticipation, charged with the knowledge that the ordinary rules of conversation were no longer in play. It was a silent acknowledgement, almost primal in its intensity, that the man beside them, this icon of professionalism and discipline, was recalibrating, measuring, calculating. Finally, his voice cut through the tension, low, measured, controlled. "Joy," he said, calm but unmistakably precise. "That's an interesting way to frame a question." There was no anger in his tone, not yet. It was something far more formidable, the absolute clarity of a man who understood exactly what he was being asked, who recognized the nature of the ambush, and who was assessing the best path forward with the deliberate calculation of someone who had survived decades of scrutiny, public opinion, and relentless industry pressure. His words were calm, measured, and almost serene, yet beneath them lay a steely undercurrent that made everyone in the room lean slightly forward, conscious that this was no ordinary exchange. Joy, sensing that she had successfully drawn a response, pressed on, the slight tilt of her body forward, suggesting both anticipation and satisfaction. "I'm just asking," she said, her tone conversational but sharp. "You put yourself out there as this example of dedication and professionalism, but your personal life tells a very different story, doesn't it? 3 marriages, Tom. 3 divorces. That's not exactly the picture of stability you're trying to sell here." The shift in the room was palpable. Whoopi Goldberg's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a silent warning and a reflection of her immediate concern for the dynamic that was rapidly unfolding. Sarah Haynes' smile, so carefully maintained through the previous discussion, froze in mid-expression, betraying her discomfort with the direction of the questioning. Sunny Hostin's hand tightened subtly on her note card, a small but telling indicator that the tension in the room was reaching a critical threshold. In the control room, producers muttered under their breath, their words a mix of disbelief and resigned anticipation. "Oh God, here we go." Yet Tom Cruise remained outwardly composed. His smile persisted, his posture unbroken, but there was a noticeable change in his eyes, a sharpness, a steely awareness that suggested complete comprehension of the moment. He had just realized the full nature of the conversation that was being imposed upon him, and he was engaging in rapid, silent calculations to determine the most effective way to respond. He understood that the question was not merely about his personal life. It was a test, a deliberate attempt to destabilize him, to provoke a reaction, to elicit vulnerability on live television. And while the external calm remained, the internal precision with which he processed the situation was formidable, a demonstration of the discipline that had defined his career. Before the tension could escalate further, Sarah Haynes attempted an intervention, her voice tentative but sincere. "Joy, that's really not," she began, clearly uneasy with the personal nature of the line of questioning and its potential to spiral beyond professional bounds. But Tom, ever in control yet now asserting a subtle authority of his own, interjected smoothly, maintaining his calm demeanor. "No, it's fine," he said, his voice soft yet carrying a new, undeniable undercurrent that compelled attention. "Joy wants to have a conversation about personal life versus professional conduct. I'm happy to have that conversation." The room, already tense, seemed to tighten further, every eye locked on him. His words were polite, measured, and deliberate, yet they carried an implicit assertion. He was no longer simply a guest to be challenged. He was an equal participant in this exchange, capable of defining its boundaries, steering its course, and maintaining control. In that moment, the studio, the audience, the co-hosts, the crew, the producers, recognized something remarkable.